Okay, so in this presentation we're going to take a look at some history, some background for the Old English period and medieval periods. Time period we're looking at is AD 449 to about 1485. And it is important that you know a little bit of the history, a little bit of what was going on during this time period that the literature we're going to read takes place in, because the time period really did have an effect on the literature of that time. So let's go ahead and take a look. It's important to realize that England during this time period was a series of invasions. So we have lots of people coming in, conquering the previous group that was there, bringing their own culture in, then in comes another group, conquers them, brings in their culture. So let's take a look at a little bit of the background of invasions. In AD 43, the Romans came in. Before that, the Celtic inhabitants were there. When the Romans came in, they drove the original Celts to the north, which is where they formed Scotland, and the west, which is where they formed what we now know as Wales. And then in AD 449, the Romans had to leave. There was a series of barbarian invaders coming into Rome, so the Roman troops were called from England, which they called Albion, and they needed to return to Rome. So when they did that, the Germanic tribes of the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes came in. And of course, Angles is where we get the term Angleland, which does eventually become England. Next, in AD 597, we have a peaceful invader. We have St. Augustine coming in, and with St. Augustine comes Christianity. And his mission was to convert the pagans, so remember those Germanic tribes. He wanted to convert them to Christianity. With him, he brought along Latin. He brought along teaching in Latin. The Bible that he brought along was in Latin. And so now we have some Latin influences going on in England. Remember, prior to this, we have Roman and Germanic influences, and of course the original Celtic influences. Now we've brought along some Latin influences as well. Next, in the 8th century, came the Danes. The Danes were not nearly as peaceful as St. Augustine. In fact, they were raiders and looters, so they would raid the peasants in the farmland. They would loot monasteries. This was not a pleasant group of invaders coming in. And then in 871, Alfred the Great comes in and he stops the Danes. Because of his ability to stop the Danes and because of the control that he was able to gain, he becomes what we now think of as the first king of England. And then in 1066, we have basically what we consider the last invasion, the Duke of Normandy, who would later be known, as William the Conqueror. Now, during this time period, after William the Conqueror came in, we now enter what we now recognize as the feudal era, about 1100 to 1485. And the feudal era is named because it's named based on the type of government, feudalism, which was brought originally by the Normans. As I said, this is a form of government, but it's also social order and land tenure. So if you take a look at the triangle on your screen, you'll see the top of the triangle is the king. So he was in the highest ranking power. Then underneath him were the lords, the vassals to the king. These were people who swore loyalty to the king. They were the upper class, the nobles. Then right underneath the lords would have been the knights. And then underneath them, of course, in the very bottom of the triangle, would have been the peasants. Now, it's important to note that this triangle was not extremely rigid. There was some fluidity there, and in fact, it was the nobles in 1215 who forced the king to sign the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta was also known as the Great Charter, and its job was to limit the powers of the king. And this was the beginning of parliamentary government in England. So just because the king was considered the top of the triangle in that idea of feudalism, the nobles still were able to force the king to sign this important document. England did face a series of hard times. The Black Death, which was another name for the plague, killed a third of the population. Then England was also dealing with intermittent wars with France for more than 100 years. The Peasants' Revolt in 1381 brought along the rise of the middle class, and then there was also a civil war going on in England from 1455 to 1485. It was the end of that civil war that Henry VII came to the throne and finally was able to generate some unity in England. It's important to note that not only does literature of this time period reflect this background of invasions and hardships, but it's also a reflection of the place, the fact that England is an island surrounded by the sea. And so the sea plays an important role in literature. The sea can be seen as a positive thing, a protective barrier against threats coming in, but it can also be seen as a threat in itself, and one that's untamable. Since it's a natural element, it's something that can't be conquered. So the sea can be both a positive and a negative in British literature. It can also be seen as a placeless place, this void that can separate one from home. It's often referred to as the sea road, and traveling the sea road is generally a road to fame and honor. It's really important that you keep this in mind as you read, especially the beginning of this unit when we're spending some time with the seafarer and we do a little bit of work with Beowulf. The sea's really going to come into play into those, so try to remember that when we get there. Okay, for this assignment, you're actually going to spend some time investigating either one of the invasions or one of the hardships or importance of the sea, and I'd like you to find some websites where you can find additional information about any of the things that were in this presentation that sparked your interest, and then give me a summary of those websites. More detailed directions are in the assignment directions for this video, so please make sure that you read the directions carefully. As always, if you have questions for me, please don't hesitate to ask.